I think it's no controversial statement to say that the continuity of Twisted Metal is at best a jumbled mess of nonsense. For every conclusion I come to, it only seems to raise more questions than it answers. Of course, the developers have stated that they didn't intend to have any deliberate continuity in the series, so from an artistic perspective it doesn't really matter. But from my perspective, I don't really give a shit. I believe in the death of the author philosophy that states every interpretation of an artistic work is equally valid. There's no correct answer, and nobody is an authority on your interpretation other than yourself, even the people who actively created the thing you're interpreting. I know I've probably said that exact statement like 100 times by now, but every video is somebody's first, so there's no guarantee that they've heard it the other 99 times. Besides, it's something that bears repeating. But still, trying to make sense of the Twisted Metal continuity is a bit of a headache at times, and no more is that apparent than with Calypso himself. I mean, even something as simple as his appearance has been a mess to keep track of. Just look at how he's evolved. He went from Carrot Top sloppily eating deep dish pizza to 2 separate versions of Morticia Addams to Big Van Vader after a crash diet and a match with Stan Hansen to Larry David back to Morticia Addams. And by the way, I'm serious about that Larry David thing, Jesus Christ. Oh yeah, I forgot about Sid from Toy Story. Then there's Calypso's ever-changing backstory. I guess he subscribes to the Joker school of backstories. You know, if I'm going to have a past, I'd prefer it to be multiple choice. The history of Calypso has been in varying stages of completeness since the dawn of the series back in 1995, back when it was an extremely early title for the PlayStation 1. But never has Calypso's backstory been more solid than in the run-up to 1996's Twisted Metal 2. It was then when Sony and DC Comics came together to create an entire tie-in comic to explain the backstory behind the enigmatic man known as Calypso. And hey, we covered the infamous comics last time, so why don't we cover this one as well? And discuss its place in the larger canon of the Twisted Metal universe, as well as discuss it as a story in its own right to see how it holds up. So, because this was before digital distribution, DC never gave it a digital release like they did for the infamous comics, at least as far as I'm aware, so there's no legal way to acquire this comic other than eBay, and physical copies can fetch extremely high prices on eBay. And why is that? Well, as it turns out, and I'm not making this up, only 100 copies were ever printed. 100. 100. It gets better too. These comics were given out as prizes for a contest held by Sony. Only 50 were ever won, and then apparently 10 more were given out to people who requested them. And the other 40 were destroyed. So there's actually only 60 of these comics that exist in a public forum. Thankfully though, the comic has been archived on the Twisted Metal wiki, but the scans kinda suck. Thankfully though, I have the advantage of a friend who could upscale them for me. Matter of fact, I think somebody hectically dropped the ball on the preservation of this comic altogether. I mean, this one page is literally just a digital photo someone took. They even left the flash on, and then they went into Photoshop to draw over the text boxes, which makes the whole thing look inconsistent. Apparently, much like pimpin', preserving history ain't easy. Well, whatever, we play with the cards we're dealt, and apparently somebody stacked the deck against me. So, how does the story go? We open in the modern day, that is to say sometime in the mid-2000s. I would imagine that this takes place during the 2006 Twisted Metal tournament, considering that all the previous tournaments were apparently held exclusively in Los Angeles, where this comic opens in New York. We get a rare glimpse into the horrors of the Twisted Metal tournament from the pedestrian level when we get interviews from people caught in the crossfire. A guy whose friend was ran over by Sweet Tooth, and a cop who got into a chase with Mr. Grimm. Apparently the tournament has become a bit of a worldwide phenomenon, leading to mass protests calling for the eradication of motor vehicles. That is until Mr. Slam shows up and breaks up the protests with the power of his chompy front loader. Womp womp. But we quickly divert away from that as we focus on Calypso himself talking to a doll. That's a sentence that needs unpacking. This doll is the major connecting theme throughout the comic. It's the one constant in Calypso's life. He keeps it around because it was the doll that belonged to his late sister. It's stated later, both directly and indirectly, that he believes that the doll contains her soul. So he feels that by speaking to the doll, he can communicate with his sister. So what exactly happened to her though? Well, to find that out, we flash all the way back to when Calypso was just a wee lad. What I immediately notice is that his character design is very reminiscent of what they would end up making him look like in Small Brawl, except, you know, blonde instead of brunette. I wonder if that was intentional. Incidentally, in Small Brawl, it's referenced that his name might be William Sparks, and it's generally accepted fanon that that's his real name, although to my knowledge, it's never been confirmed. At heart, this entire comic is a means to show Calypso's descent into madness, but they make it clear that Calypso was always an extremely troubled kid. At the age of 12 in 1968, he had a fascination with collecting roadkill. However, everything that is, was, or ever would end up being Calypso is kickstarted by a snake of all things. You see, for all the roadkill he's collected, what he sees as a prized possession is a roadkill snake. It's possible that the snake was meant to represent a parallel to the snake in the Garden of Eden, the snake that was in fact Satan in disguise, who tempted Eve into eating from the Tree of Knowledge, because in this case, the temptation of the snake directly leads to Calypso's downfall. Plus, Satan plays a role in this story later on, so I'm not entirely convinced that this doesn't go deeper, and instead of being a representation or a parallel to the snake in the Garden of Eden, this isn't actually just literally Satan. This right here is the first time that the boy who would eventually become Calypso ever turned on a car in his life, and he looks to run the snake over, but in the process, smushes his little sister across the pavement.
Fucking whoops.
To the point of just being a pile of blood. That's pretty disturbing, but his parents don't seem to be too hung up about it. His father's reaction is practically,
"Young man, you ain't getting no dinner till you clean your sister off that goddamn pavement, I tell you what. Don't make me bust out the belt, Papa's coming."
Yeah, I think somebody's reaction to their daughter succumbing to vehicular manslaughter at the hands of their son should garner a little bit more of an extreme reaction than that. But then again, he's also wearing a wife beater, so, draw your own conclusions. Now, this is a traumatizing experience that would pretty much break anybody, and that's certainly true for Calypso. It becomes the linchpin of the path Calypso would eventually be led down, because the guilt from that experience gave Calypso a death wish. From then on, he'd be driven mad, and Calypso knew that the only way for him to go out properly, in the way that he deserved, was a spectacular car wreck. It all started only 2 years later when Calypso and his parents were driving to the cemetery to leave flowers on his sister's grave, and while his parents are arguing, Calypso, in his first act of suicidal intention, causes a car wreck which kills 8 people including his parents. Not Calypso though, he and the doll practically walked away without a scratch, so it looks like he is quite lucky, or unlucky as the case may be. Also, can I mention that he went from this to this in only 2 years? Apparently he's 14 when he kills his parents, but he looks like he's aged 8 to 10 years between the first flashback and the second flashback. Considering he looks the same after a 20-year time jump, you could have at least made him look a bit younger here. Now, he befriends a redneck who gave him a job fixing cars. This is also the guy who gave Calypso his nickname, because our guy was hammering out a steel beam in a rhythm that sounded like Calypso music, and Redneck does the most American thing ever.
I ain't down with that Caribbean crap!
He was drunk, but still. Either way, after he apologizes, Redneck starts calling our guy Calypso as a means of endearment. I don't know if I'd personally accept a nickname from a person who shot me and have the nickname be based on the reason they shot me. It'd be like if you got shot for sleeping with somebody's wife, and to make it up to you, they start calling you Homewrecker. But as established, Calypso wants to die, so he probably appreciated the opportunity to be shot. It's not the most dramatic or poetic way that anybody's ever got a nickname, but it's a perfectly serviceable means to hand-wave that little question away. As a further apology, Redneck Dude lets Calypso drive in the demolition derby he was doing work for, even gives Calypso a customized helmet. You know, for an angry racist redneck, he's alright. This event would change Calypso's life forever, as he would spend the next 20 years on the demolition derby circuit hoping to go out in a blaze of glory, but seemingly he's only able to cause the death of other people. Despite gaining a large following of people who just want to see him die, he wins tournament after tournament, taking home the purse every time. It's an intriguing, albeit morbid idea to have a character characterized by their desire to end their own life, but being unable to do so. Come to think of it, that's basically Kratos. Calypso got married, had a kid, accidentally got his wife killed, and became a neglectful single father, all while drifting deeper and deeper into insanity. But this is where things get a little bit weird. Up until this point, nothing about Calypso's story was wild, wacky, or more to the point, completely impossibly bonkers. But now we're introduced to the supernatural elements when his dead wife shows up, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. She whines about being in hell and finally inspires Calypso to just let go of the steering wheel and let the chips fall where they may, finally letting himself die in a spectacular car crash. Well, the fact that it was at the hands of a nondescript wall as opposed to one of his demolition derby opponents in front of a paying crowd was probably a bit disappointing, but beggars can't be choosers. The story's not over though, as we see Calypso graduate from average Joe Schmo to the all-powerful godlike figure he ended up being in the space of 2 pages. He goes straight to hell and meets Minion face to face for the first time, setting up their long-standing rivalry. Minion is one of Satan's, well, minions, who's tasked with torturing Calypso for the next couple 100,000 years, but Calypso gives him the slip and meets Satan face to face. Satan, interestingly, also looks like one of the guys from right before Calypso dies at the Straight 8 Lounge. I don't think that was a coincidence. That combined with the earlier point, I think Satan was keeping an eye on Calypso and wanted to use this as an opportunity to bring him in, so to speak. Now that Minion has been disposed of, there's a position open as one of Hell's lieutenants. Satan is sick of all the good drivers surviving and living long lives, while all the terrible drivers are the ones who end up in Hell. Satan wants some refreshing entertainment, so proposes a plan to Calypso, and thus, the Twisted Metal Tournament was born. The best Demolition Derby competitors from all around the world compete. The winner gets their greatest wish granted, the losers get to entertain the man downstairs. All overseen by our guy. Pretty sweet deal if you ask me. And the collateral damage? Screw it, the Statue of Liberty has never looked better. Whoa, actually, I just realized something. Hold up, let's back up a bit. Oh boy, this is awkward, isn't it? Yeah, you know what buildings those are? Oh, wow, okay then. I would just like to point out that this comic was made in 1996, so, yeah. Kind of awkward in hindsight, isn't it? Yeah, let's move on without a backwards glance, okay? Yeah, this comic is only 16 pages, and initially I was thinking it's a shame because I thought it impossible to tell a compelling story in 16 pages, but that's not what my old writing teacher from university told me. He told me that a well-written story of any length can be compelling, it's just a matter of what details to keep in, and more importantly, what details to omit. This is a case where they made each panel count, and since it's a character's backstory, they can skip over a lot of the chaff to get to the interesting parts because they're not telling a complete narrative with a first, second, and third act. They're just giving you the highlights as a means to contextualize a larger story, and I think it's actually a pretty compelling story, showing how Calypso started from humble beginnings and eventually became an all-seeing, all-knowing godlike figure. All connected through the context of Calypso discussing his life with who he thinks is his sister, and the story touches on a lot of less than comfortable topics. Bereavement, guilt, trauma, suicide, adultery, neglectful parenting. Until Calypso's dead wife shows up, it manages to be a grounded and weirdly human story. I was half expecting it to turn into the 2019 Joker movie. Matter of fact, the actual Twisted Metal Tournament seems like a bit of an afterthought in the grand scheme of the story. By the end of only 16 pages, I had practically forgotten about the mass protests or Mr. Slam mowing through a crowd of people Carmageddon style. Go on in Mr. Slam, and welcome to the Mr. Jam. It's interesting that they gave a definitive timeline to Calypso's life as well. He was 12 in 1968, so he was born in 1956. Though it's possible he could have been born in early 1957, depending on what time of year it is during the mention of his age in the scene in 1968. I think that's how it works. Names and numbers are two things I've never been good with. So let's calculate. If he's 12 in 1968, the comic time jumps twice by 2 years and once by 20 years. There might be a time jump before his death that doesn't get mentioned, but assuming there isn't, he's roughly 36 at the time of his death in 1992, and despite being immortal, he'd technically be roughly 40 at the time of the first Twisted Metal Tournament in 1996, which would also make him roughly 50 by the time of the 10th Twisted Metal Tournament in 2005 that takes place in the first game, and 51 in 2006, which is when Twisted Metal 2 is set, the very game this comic is a tie-in for. Did they intend for the first game to coincide with his 50th birthday? Was there some kind of meaning behind that, or was that an unintentional detail? In my internal headcanon, I believe there was an unsaid time jump before Calypso dies, because I would find it weird if he died in 1992 and agreed to start a tournament of death, but then sat on his ass for 4 years. At least without Satan getting a little bit angry. Unless it was something that took 4 years to organize, but then he's magical. Surely he has resources that go beyond mortal limitations. Although I will say, the fact that Calypso was born in the 50s is further proof that Twisted Metal 3 and 4 are part of an alternate timeline to 1 or 2. As we know, Twisted Metal 4 starts with a piece of retroactive continuity that can't coexist with the first and second game. That the Twisted Metal Tournament had been going on since the dawn of automobiles. However, the first game states that 2005 was the 10th Twisted Metal Tournament. So one of these things is not like the others. I've heard it suggested that 2005 was just the 10th official tournament, and the whole thing had been operating at an unofficial capacity for decades. But if the Twisted Metal tournament not being an official thing back then wasn't enough of a retcon, how about Calypso being a fully grown man in the early 1900s when he wasn't born until the 1950s? The actual game should take precedent over a non-core piece of side content like a tie-in comic, of course, but this is just an additional piece of proof. Besides, the onus is on the game to tell us why plot holes and inconsistencies fit into established events. It shouldn't be on us to create sense out of something that doesn't make sense. And to me, the easiest explanation is to assume that the different backstories between this comic as well as the first two games and the intro to Twisted Metal 4 can be explained by these two pieces of media existing in alternate timelines. Especially when you take into account that Head-On is deliberately meant as a sequel to the second game that retcons the third and by extension the fourth game. So you either have Head-On retcon Twisted Metal 3 and 4, or you have 3 and 4 existing as its own thing. And I prefer that Twisted Metal 3 and 4 not be non-canon, just part of an alternate timeline. So I guess that means that Calypso's backstory hasn't actually been retconned in this continuity. It's just one possible backstory in a multitude of alternate possible realities. It's only retconned if you side with the fourth game being a definitive sequel to 2, which personally I don't. But then again, that's just one interpretation, and I've heard a lot of very interesting interpretations. There's a lot you can interpret from this comic, and it's definitely a piece of media that, while nondescript, adds quite a few extra layers to the lore of a series that already has a lot of interesting and unique lore. Surprising, considering that this is a series about glorified demolition derby. Still, I think this series is better off having this comic whether you personally subscribe to the belief that it's been retconned, or if you're in my camp and see it as something that's still an integral part of the series. But that's about as much blood as I can get from this stone, so if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing and hitting that bell icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Plus, let me know what you think in the comment section. Otherwise, until next time, I've been the King of Snark Style on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will catch you on the flip side. Peace.